Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 7th session today on Armenian art and architecture. Dr. Ervine will speak today on churches of the Cilician West and compare it with the churches of the Zakrit, the Broshian, and the Hassan Jalalian clans in the East. Not much remains of Armenian church architecture in Cilicia. The ruins of the Catholicos Church of Romkala, home to the Pachlafoni Catholicoses, and the church in the Rubenites favored monasteries at Anavaraz are exceptions. Elsewhere in the Armenian world, the Zakrit, Broshian, and the Hassan Jalalian clans built numerous churches in far northern Armenia, Sunik, and Artsakh, including the great complex of the Sunik province episcopal see, Norabank, which we will look at today, and the monastic complex of Ganzasar. Many of these sites are the recent loss of these sites have been part of our discussions, even to this very day. Here we have one example where historical studies become relevant for our modern discussion, informing us all that has gone before us and yet is still part of our discussion today. So with that, Dr. Ervine, if I may turn the speak to you. If you would close it. And I will close it. Sure. And if I may mention, we have a very special guest in our audience today. Dean Shahinian is with us in person, so it's very nice to have you, Dean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've seen it on video, and I'm delighted to be here in person.
And now you know it's real.
Yes, Dean is joining us for a special event that's taking place tomorrow evening as we welcome Dr. Ani Shahinian to our staff at St. Nexus. Officially, she's been with us for a couple of months already now. All right, as we saw last week,
I didn't even know. I took out
the focus of the royal Bagratid builders of churches, people like Khosrow Vanush, who built the church at Sanahin, or Queen Katranide, who built the cathedral at Ani. These builders shifted away from the intimate spaces that had characterized Armenian worship in the days when things were more clan-focused. And they had moved towards larger, more upward-reaching spaces, in part because they could, and in part because in their understanding, such structures befit the worship of people who were now under a centralized, powerful, indigenous government. This doesn't mean that smaller scale worship faded away. Rather, side by side with the smaller, more intimate spaces, grandeur like this, upward movement like this, became important. We might even look at structures like these as having been influenced by the millennium. Maybe we could call them millennial building. Since the change from intimacy to an upward orientation coincided with the very widely anticipated start of the new millennium as it was calculated on the Western calendar, and also by traditional calculations of the age of the world. So things that clustered around the date 1000 tended to all have over them the kind of shadow or maybe the penumbra, the glow of the anticipation of the return of Christ. By the time that we get to today, of the 13th and 14th centuries, the glow has faded. Complexity has returned, has set in. People have to recalculate, recalibrate how they're going to live, how they're going to worship in a setting where the parousia is no longer imminent, as far as they can tell. And so we're going to see a rise in different types of things. We're going to see a rise in layers of complexity. We're going to see a rise in people's desire to upgrade, for lack of a better word, to upgrade older structures and bring them into the new age, bring them into sync with the spirituality of the times. And also to help to point out certain things to certain people. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking specifically about frescoed churches as well as cave churches. And at that point, we will look at the content of some of this exegesis. You'll have a foretaste of it next week when Dr. Shahinian takes us to the cathedral on Achtermann. So these changes in cultural approach, these new desires to upgrade and to build on top of, if you like, to increase the detail and the complexity of buildings, not making them simple standing structures, but rather creating them into complexes. This comes about in the context of demographic changes that help to take Armenian church architecture out of the relatively narrow confines of the Armenian highlands. That is, in the 13th to 14th century, right before the time that we get to the Ottomanization of the region, and spread it out into other places that are sometimes a bit surprising. By mentioning demographic change in this circumstance, I'm really talking about the growing phenomenon of Armenian diaspora. A diaspora was nothing new for Armenians since at least the time of St. Gregory, not before. Armenians had readily availed themselves of the advantages that were offered to them by visits to the Byzantine territories in particular, or by permanent residence within those territories. There was an ethos that came with being educated in Byzantium, and many Armenians were. They served in the Byzantine armed forces, sometimes garnering in reward for their service land holdings on the edges of the empire, so something between their homeland and the imperial holdings. In any case, this level of education and imperial service could and very often did lead to advancement in career and also to prosperity and prestige. And so we find Armenian names, even Armenian houses and lineages, in the lists of Byzantine civil servants at every level. And ethnic Armenians, although not always attached to their Armenian heritage, sometimes not even particularly favorable to the causes of Armenia, rose to the imperial throne, especially in the 9th and 10th centuries, which had something to do as well, if we had more time to discuss the history of it, with building programs like the one at Ani. But while there were advantages, worldly advantages, to a close relationship with Byzantium, it's notable that the intellectual and architectural creations of these Byzantinized Armenians were generally Byzantine in their style and in their interests. migrations of Armenians out of their native highlands into other parts of the world. And Armenians did spread everywhere, from Norway to Belgium, to the Crimean Peninsula, to India, the Far East, the Middle East. These Armenians who consciously left their homeland were not always wedded to a Byzantine aesthetic, whether or not they went into the diaspora through Byzantine means. Their architecture is a really interesting kind of blend of indigenous foundations, the kind of style that perhaps they were a little nostalgic for, a style that they wanted to use perhaps to identify themselves as who they were in their new locations. On the one hand, there's that element to their style. On the other hand, they were open to neighborhood influences. And we will see some examples of that shortly, because we're going to be looking at churches in three widely separated areas: the Crimean Peninsula, Cilicia, and Jerusalem. But before we do that, before we look at the diasporan churches, I think we should spend some time, maybe quite a bit of time, because thinking of where we're going to be going, there's so much to say about these church complexes. We should spend some time in the Armenian home highlands, seeing what Armenians were building for themselves in these centuries on their native soil. And it has to be said that we often complain about the potential rivalries that there are between groups of Armenians, families of Armenians, important Armenians of one type or another. And while there can be political disadvantages to this type of competition, architecturally speaking, it has been a wonderful thing. It's thanks to competition between clans like the Orbelians and the Brosians that we have thickly concentrated churches and church complexes all across the southeast of historic Armenia. And this takes place despite the fact that in the space of the 2 centuries that we are focusing on this evening, 3 different empires came and went on the Armenian highlands. And if you look at the map that is posted here, you can see that the word Armenia appears across all of it. I think partly because if it wasn't there, you would have no idea. When you look at the colors on this map, you can see the many divisions that pertain even in the early part of the 13th century in the Armenian homelands. You see names familiar and unfamiliar. You see many Arabic or Islamic names. And it's into this fragmented landscape, this landscape that Armenians themselves obviously still recognize as Armenian, but no one else necessarily does. It's in this fragmented landscape that we find first the Seljuk Sultanate in the 13th century, then the Mongol Empire in the mid-14th century, an empire that would reach down to Jerusalem at its peak, and then the Tatar Empire in the early 15th. Each successive wave of these invasions helped to increase the presence of Armenians in their diaspora, pushing people from the east toward the west. Briefly, in the early days of the Mongol Empire, things were relatively better because the Mongols initially had good relations with Armenians, particularly Armenians in Cilicia. The Mongols chose not to replace or displace the Nakharar families that had traditionally governed the highlands. And so it could be, from time to time, that in between waves of invasion and violence, in between periods of seismic activity, both political and terrestrial, there were periods of relative quiet in which enterprising princely houses could muster the wherewithal to leave their mark on the landscape, to claim, as it were, physical and spiritual territory for themselves, for however many years that might be possible before the next invasion. And so across this period, isolated pockets of Armenian power came and went. To name just a few of them: Yersinga, Erzincan, Erzurum, flourished in the early and middle 13th century under their nobleman bishop, Dersakis, until he was assassinated in 1276. And into this rough landscape, he and others inserted 24 monasteries and over 50 churches, 77 Armenian worship spaces in all, including the monastery church of Saints Thaddeus and Bartholomew, also known as Sebu Avakbank, in Yersinga. Let me show it to you. You can see a sample of what they were able to do in this early 13th century period. Here's a map of the Yersinga region, and you can see how many Armenian locations are on it, ringed by the mountains and radiating from Yersinga itself in the upper left. Today, this is what you would look for: Kemaliye. And so the structures of Dersakis at Avakbank are nestled into this mountainous landscape. Might have something to do with why part of it is still standing. Here's a picture of Avakbank from the distance. You can see there's really not a road to it. Kind of have to get yourself there. And its remains, you can see that this is not in good shape. You can see that one more good earthquake, and that structure to the left is probably going to come down. Nonetheless, the fact that any of it is left is quite remarkable. As you can see, the roof is completely gone. But when you look at it, you can see that it's actually 3 structures, and then you can see fallen stones from other structures that were around the churches. This is what Avakbank looks like. Here is its plan. The small church of Astvadzadzin, Holy Mother of God, on the right in your top drawing, was a taller church, although much smaller than its neighbor. And as you can see, it has two kind of overdeveloped side aisle areas. It's almost as if you have a secondary church on the far right. The church on the left, marked C, the Church of Thaddeus and Bartholomew, is broader, lower, longer. Also newer. So the idea of adding to a smaller worship space to create something more complicated, more detailed in a pleasing manner, and so on, is clearly operative here too. The two churches, and you can see that the Church of Thaddeus and Bartholomew is a three-aisled basilica with a dome over the center, two small side chapels on the eastern end. The two churches, the large and the small, are joined by a third, a church dedicated to St. John the Baptist, a phenomenon that we're going to see in other places as well, the joining of John the Baptist with Mary in a configuration that leads to the larger church and its meaning. If you look below at the elevation, you can see how interesting the roof line was on this complex. From the tall roof on the Mother of God to the relatively low one on Thaddeus and Bartholomew. This structure can be better seen. Here's another view of it from different angles. You can see that the church has lost almost all of its clean stone facing, and what you're really looking at are the small stones that were filler in the church to grant it more stability. We're fortunate, thank you, Hushamatyan website, to have this photo showing a pilgrimage to Avakvank by Armenians in the pre-genocide period. And you can see that the churches are already not in the very best possible condition, but that whole middle section has been roofed over in order to create more space for the crowds that would come to attend service at this complex. You can compare that to the present status. At least this was present 20 years ago. We also have a photograph. I'm sorry about the quality of the photograph, but it was taken just after the mid-20th century by an indefatigable cataloger of Armenian structures and his wife, Jean-Michel and Nicole Thierry, who did amazing work trekking across the Anatolian landscape in order to record the remains of literally hundreds of Armenian churches and monasteries. And their repertoire of Armenian churches in Anatolia is still an invaluable resource. This photo shows the supports, the supporting arches that once held the very short dome at the center of the structure. There's also one photo of the dome prior to its collapse, and you can see that this was a newspaper photo. You can see the texture of the paper showing through the photograph. It's a very poor quality photo, but you can still make out the 8 sections of the dome. And you can see that the substructure supporting the dome was once plastered, clean, perhaps even faced with a better quality of stone. There are still remains of that plaster in the altar niche. And you can see one intact arch forming a side aisle leading to a small chapel on the left. The corresponding arch on the right is unfortunately destroyed. And despite its current endangered state, it's very clear, both from pictures like the pilgrimage photo and from decorative elements like this that remain, that this church was lovingly decorated. And this cross in particular is fascinating. You know how when we were children, well, maybe it was a longer time ago than for most of you, but it used to be something that you would do to take your pen, put it on the paper or your pencil, your crayon, and draw an entire picture without lifting the pencil from the paper. Do it all in one line. It looks like that's what's happened with this cross. And so you have this single, very ornamental line creating foliage that just seems to be dripping from the cross, presumably one of many that used to adorn this church. The second place where building was happening, Armenians were in a powerful position, able to indulge themselves in building beautiful structures, was the Principality of Ardas in the southeast homeland, the end of the 13th and the early 14th centuries, where a bishop named Zachariah and his brother Petros poured their resources into building, among other things, into restoring places like this.
Wow.
Talk about intimate worship spaces. We don't know, at least I don't know, whether this was the only church at Zorzor Monastery. But as you can see, it would not look out of place in an earlier age in the heartland of Armenia. It's a very small cruciform shape. It was the centerpiece of a monastery that in the 14th century became a bastion of Roman Catholic Armenian learning. It was one of several thorns in the flesh endured by Grigor Datevatsi, who worked tirelessly to put Armenian scholarship on a par with that of the much better funded Roman Catholic Church and its missions in this area. When you look at this church, though, there's one thing that does seem a little bit out of place. Compared to the size of the rest of the structure, the drum for the dome seems really high. And in fact, the presence of a taller drum beneath the dome often signaled Chalcedonian influence in Armenian architecture, specifically, but not exclusively, Georgian influence.
Oh, what's the current name for this?
Zorzor. Yeah, it has kept the same name. Now in Iran's West Azerbaijan province, somewhat infelicitously named under the current political circumstances, you can see that the church has been restored. And interestingly, in the 1980s, it was physically moved 600 meters from its actual location. They simply picked it up and moved it in order to preserve it from inundation by a new dam that was being built in the area. A completely different take on Armenian architecture in the 14th century. More of a nostalgic building, more of a hearkening back to the roots kind of building. Perhaps very appropriate for a community of learned men who were stepping away from the Armenian Church's tradition into the world, the intellectual world of the West. So it's already obvious that even within the homelands of Armenia, there is a lot of variety in building from this period. And in fact, as we saw earlier, there's a desire to have all of the variety visible at once. So let me show you another place. This is a success story for sure in the life of Armenian medieval churches. The Holy Mother of God Church, Surp Astvazadzin Kharijavank, built in 1201 as an addition to a 7th century monastery, built by Prince Zakare Zakarian, whose family, they're an extraordinary family. His family was half Chalcedonian, half non-Chalcedonian. So half Byzantine leaning and half Lusa-Chagan. And they had a special gift in this family for straddling uncomfortable lines. It didn't seem to bother them at all if they had one foot in one world and one in another. They could make their way in all of them. And it was Zakare Zakarian who commissioned the building of the cruciform Church of the Mother of God. Here you can see a view of the complex, taken from a little bit of an elevation. Give you a little bit more feel for the way that it cozies up to the rocks behind it. And if you look at it from this side, the way that it manages at one and the same time to be almost embedded in the rock and hanging over a gorge. Kind of an ideal Armenian situation, perhaps also politically relevant. It's an interesting structure, the Mother of God Church. It has 2-story sacristies in all 4 of its corners. Perhaps buttressing the structure and perhaps simply providing extra interesting spaces on the inside. The building, like other Zakard structures, is characterized by a high relief Byzantine cross, which you can see on the center portion of the church surrounding the window. A favored statement in their architectural vocabulary showing the cross as the source of light. You also notice that it has another one of those taller domes, not quite as out of proportion to the rest of the structure as the previous one at Zorzur, but nonetheless noticeable. And that isn't the only cross on the structure. Here you see it from a different angle, but you can also see a second one on the adjoining side of the church, again, framing a window, making that same kind of statement. Here's one on the third side of the church, more elaborate, almost having an Armenian feeling to it because of the steps beneath the cross, which occurs frequently in Armenian khachkars. Having a cross within the cross as well. And here we get a better view of the one I showed you 2 slides previously. I wanted to include this because it shows you where Prince Zachary chose to have himself added to the church. You can see he is handing over the church to another figure. To do this handover, to offer this gift, he is standing at the foot of the cross. A posture that was certainly appropriate to his own very great faith. Then as we come down closer to the church, we begin to see other elements. It's not just Armenian structures with a Georgian flair or a Chalcedonian tone. The door to the Kavi, as you approach it, you can see it there in the center, does not look traditionally Armenian. And if you come closer to it, you go, oh, no, definitely not. And I'm sure that this structure came up in the session on Islamic architecture. These mihrab-shaped doorways, these pointed, beautiful, graceful arches. As we said, the Zacharids were quite capable of straddling several divides at one time. Chalcedonian Lusavorchagan, Armenian Islamic. And when you look more closely at the area above this door within that pointed arch, once your eye stops being confused by all of these kind of oddly distributed shapes, you begin to notice certain things about them. There are basically 3 shapes represented. There are triangles, quadrangles, so 4-sided shapes in different forms and arrangements. So sometimes they're pushed into a diamond shape, sometimes they're a little bit more rhomboidal or trapezoidal, whatever they are. And then you have pentagons. So 3, 4, and 5.
Armand's seeing the arch to look like a flamed candle. It's a good imagination.
I'm sure the Muslims would be happy to hear that. And as you
just-
can see, everyone is different in its internal
Yes,
decoration.
that's right. Just to clarify one question for the audience, the name of the church again.
The name of the church is the Holy Mother of God at Halvartsin.
Hagarzin.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Holy Mother of God in Hagarzin.
Mm-hmm. And as your eye gets more used to it, you realize that there are stars. The red triangles, at least some of them, form stars. 5-pointed stars, 5-pointed geometric objects. You could stand and look at this for a significant amount of time, just admiring all of the different patterns of geometric interlace that there are in this one doorway.
And Father Garabet asks, would you consider heightened domes might define a greater importance to one structure among a grouping of others? Or
I don't think so. I think it's more of a Chalcedonian sympathetic statement. We don't find it very often in churches by Armenian Orthodox. And whether there's always possible that that's just a feature of technical competency or the location of the church that you're not as concerned about the dome falling in. I don't know. But it's noticeably present in structures by Chalcedonians. And not only are there those fascinating, highly complicated forms above the doorway, but also when you come inside the Kavi, you can see that in the ceiling are other geometric patterns, panels of geometric patterns. Again, you can get a sore neck in this church just looking up. It's a fabulous place. And a mukarna ceiling. And yet all of these Islamicized forms lead, after you've admired them, and they are beautiful, into a space characterized much more by specifically Christian motifs and pristine Armenian proportions. An Armenian sanctuary in what for this time period has become its purest form, with soaring vaults. It's a very tall church. Yet the space maintains certain intimate sectors or qualities in the form of private rooms in the second story of the church. You would go up the very tall stairs to get to those rooms. Those are not stairs for the average person's leg height. It takes some serious effort to get up there. I had visited a church in Sunik, an earlier church, where they didn't even have the stairs. The rooms were there, but they had a ladder. And so when you wanted to get up there, or somebody wanted you to go up there, you would go up the ladder, and then the ladder would be taken away. Meditate. About all there is to do up there. Meditate, listen to the service if there is one below, stay out of the view of the people below. So there is a private aspect, even to these very large churches. The last time I was at Halartzin, I didn't think to look at what I'm going to show you next, but I'm kicking myself and thinking the next time I go back, definitely. It's easy to visit Halartzin now, relatively speaking, because it has been fully restored. It is the feeder school for the Echmiadzin Jamara. And it's in beautiful condition. In the forefront of this picture, you can just about see a kind of a rock pedestal. It blends in with everything else, but as you get a little closer to it, you can see that it's actually freestanding. Speaking about private spaces where you need a ladder to get there. And on top of this rock formation is a small cell. There's something very similar to it on Mount Sinai, actually. And so one wonders, I'm sure someone knows, but I just wonder, whether this is not left over from the presence at one point of a stylite attached to this monastery. I'll look into it. If you go to Halartzin or Harijavan, you can see remnants of pachkars, pieces of sculpture everywhere. They're being used now to line walkways, carefully preserving the bits and pieces that are left that won't fit into the modern church. Now, probably one of the most excellent and extraordinary examples of a gradually built, gradually complexified worship space is Noravank. I'm sure most of you have been to Noravank. If you haven't, You have an extraordinary experience awaiting you. The Church of the Holy Mother of God at Noravank, which is now the most prominent church in that complex, also known as Burdela Shen because a man named Burdel Orbelian had it built, was added onto an existing monastery founded in 1105, where there were already a couple of more ancient churches, and we will look at them all. Although it was sacked by the Mongols in the 13th century, it was quickly rebuilt and it continued to operate and to add structures to itself into the late 14th. For those of you who are history buffs, Noravank was the seat of the Bishop of Syuni, and in this time period, 1299 to be exact, Bishop Stepanos Syunetsi Orbelian wrote his history here in this complex. The place was so extraordinary, as you're going to see, that it attracted the best of the best when it came to its artistic decoration and to its architectural structures and reconstructions. So the artist Momik, you may have heard of, lived and worked here. In fact, Noravank, I think, was his last project. He's buried on the premises. And so did the architect, famous at the time, named Siranes. Noravank is also one of the most spectacular examples of how, in this time period, Armenian architects incorporated the landscape into the church. Or they incorporated the church into the landscape. I guess it depends on which way you look at it. So that the church, which in its own structure included all of the elements of the universe, if you knew where to look for them, would itself also be fully enclosed in the God-built landscape around it. The church and the landscape work together to create a vast worship space. When praying within the structure, one also has access to the feeling, the sensation of enormous space outside it. And no matter what angle you choose to look at Noravank from, you find it in a state of symbiotic harmony with the landscape from which its stones came. They share color. They share shape. The buildings, in addition to being perfect in and of themselves, as we will see, are also perfectly sited. And at any time of year, that matching quality between the man-made structure and the God-made surroundings is remarkable. You can also see another feature of churches in this period, the open dome. So not only are there windows letting in the light, but it's almost as though the kumbet is floating on the light. Also makes a very cold interior to the church, but that's another point. And on this church too, you can see, as we saw at Harchavan, monumental crosses surrounding windows. Burdel Orbelian was well aware of the fashions of his time and approved of the theological statements that they made. with or without sunlight. This is still a perfect place. Centered on two main churches, the Holy Mother of God, which is built as the burial space for Orbelian's family, and the Church of St. Garabed, the lower church, the older church. So let's look first at Burdel's chosen church, lovingly created as his own and his family's eternal resting space. Now, the first thing that strikes people about this building is what, would you think?
Stairs.
It's those stairs. Fortunately, I think there's a rope there now, but if you were really curious, no?
It's closed off now.
It's closed off now? Somebody must have fallen. It nearly was me years ago, but those stairs are really, really narrow. A person my size has to go up sideways on those stairs. And they're, so you can imagine, why would you do that on the front of a building? Why would you entice people? Why would you make that the only way to get to the top? Why would you make that the only possibility for how you're going to get to that upper chapel? This church is created like an icon, or like a manuscript illumination in the Armenian tradition. It's 2 stories, clearly marked out on this facade by that staircase and by the horizontal elements of the decoration, represent 2 coexisting levels of reality. The earthly level below, the level of death, the level of burial, and the heavenly level above. A level which it is not by any means easy to attain. And so there's this almost like the ladder to heaven, the stairway to heaven. The ladder of St. John Climacus, when he describes in his famous work the process of how a monk or a priest or a bishop finally reaches heaven if he does not fall off any of those stairs on his way up. That's a very detailed and interesting text. And I think something like that is at play here. If you want to go to that second story, if you want to attain and use the celestial reality that coexists with your earthly reality, it will take you some effort.
Did nobility go up?
I don't know that it was limited to that.
Yeah.
Might have been, but I don't think so. I think it's there for the statement. And as we'll see, there are other elements here that will make it clearer what this building is iconographically intending to do. So you see there are 2 doors, one above the other.
That's right.
About the same size, and they have similar shapes, but the one at the bottom is much less decorated than the one at the top. So you can see at the bottom, there's a couple of columns to the sides of the doorway, but at the top, there are bands of stars, bands of very interlaced patterns within stars. And if you count them, how many are there? There should be 8 on each side, and 6 across the top, not counting the 2 in the corners that we already counted for the 8. So it's as though the 8s are being consciously repeated. All of those stars are also 8-sided, 8-pointed stars. So you have statement after statement, affirmation after affirmation of the incredible diversity that there is within the sphere of the eighth day of creation. The eighth day of creation celebrated in liturgy and in patristic literature as the day which comes after creation. The eternal day, the day where there is no more night. And so you have this multiformed affirmation of the existence, validity, and eternal presence of that reality just above, just over the normal reality we live in that has to be supported by pillars, where there are little glimpses of the complex beauty that is to come in the little birds and things above the corners or just underneath the staircase in the corners above the door. So there's that aspect of it.
Comparing to the Byzantium, Janine notes that the nobility, it was for the nobility to go up to the chamber. And that's what Clamicus was elaborating upon, she comments.
There's a connection, yes. I'm not sure that it was totally reserved for them, though, in this case.
And is there perhaps a sense that the staircase is symbolic of Jacob's ladder? Okay.
Absolutely, and that the staircase is also symbolic of what you see underneath an Armenian chachka. So in a chachka, very often, the cross sits on a stepped foundation. And while some have suggested that that represents a Zoroastrian fire temple, which is always possible, or it could be one of the things it represents, it is also a reference to Jacob's ladder.
And is there that sense of the heavenly kingdom and the earthly?
Yes, but they coexist.
They coexist.
They are both there, so to speak, at the same time. The eternal and the eternal and time are present.
Yeah. Got it.
Couple of comments. In the church on the bottom, once you enter, you actually take even steps down. And the altar is lower than the ground floor. And you can see in this photo, once you get to the top, it's actually open.
Yeah, you're looking into that open dome.
You're connected to the heavens even more.
You can actually physically see the heavens.
And even by the doors on the bottom, it's the church, it's the mother of God with Christ, it's the church on earth. But on top of the door, on the top, on the second story, it's Christ, surrounded by angels, I believe.
It's Christ with Peter and Paul.
But it's Christ seated in his glory.
Yes. So you have Christ seated as a human on the lap of his mother, below, flanked by angels. A very mature looking child, to be sure.
Detailed it is.
And up above you have, as was mentioned, Christ in glory, Christ preaching with Peter and Paul to his sides. And you can keep this configuration in your mind because we'll come back to it when we go to Jerusalem. This configuration of Christ centrally placed and Peter and Paul at his sides.
One more comment, if I may.
Absolutely.
Would you mind going back to that picture where you can see the altar? I mean, the dome, this one. Maybe what I'm thinking is the stairs can also symbolize the mountain with the cross on top.
Absolutely. There's nothing to say that there is one interpretation of this. And you may see more and more in it as you become more accustomed to inhabiting its space. So the earthly reality of us, the heavenly reality of us, the earthly reality of Christ, the heavenly reality of Christ, the church on earth, the church in heaven, it's all there.
And Janine adds pillars of the church, maybe even the Mount of Transfiguration.
Oh, one would think, yes.
Yeah.
Probably every mountain.
And that's the sort of the power of the art to be able to give you the multiple
Yes.
interpretations.
They're not kidding when they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You could write a book. People have. Garin Matevosyan, the great scholar of the Madenataran, has a nice book on Norabank. If your Armenian is good, it's available for download online. And it includes everything like how to read these inscriptions and so on and so forth. Here is the space above. Very simple, very open air. I cannot imagine visiting this church in the winter and standing through a badarak in this space. I think it would be incredibly cold.
Hmm.
And the simplicity of this space, the focus on the light coming from above, the focus on the connection to heaven, the immediacy of that dome sitting right on top of the arch. There's no space in between. It's another angle on it. The fact that it has 3 arches, 1 window, all of these things work together to speak well of Orbelian's understanding. And then when you go to the other side of the church, he has kind of the same statement, but in symbolism rather than in figurative sculpture. So as you can see, the stairs in this case are on the outside of the cross. The cross itself surmounts an 8-sided figure in which there is another cross. So the cross beyond and within the ages. And then below that is yet another cross framing the window. So the light in the physical world, the realm in which we normally live, is connected, physically connected there to the 8-sided figure of existence beyond time, which is in turn connected to the cross. The second and older church, which is now somewhat overshadowed, I don't think accidentally, by Bourdel's church, is the Church of St. Garabed. Interesting structure. You can see it has a cavity attached to it on the far left of the picture. When you go into the cavity, you find yourself walking across the tombs of yet other notable people from this family. The space is darker, significantly darker. And the stairs up to the sanctuary, again, are challenging. These are not stairs that you're just going to trip thoughtlessly up. If you do, you'll probably break your nose. So the door itself is small. The stairs are high. Again, there's a feeling of attainment when you reach the top of these stairs. You might even be a little bit winded as you walk into the sanctuary. And you can see that the sanctuary door is flanked by 2 massive bajkars. The way in is through the cross. Inside the church, there's another one of those staircases to the private space. But the real attraction to the Church of St. Garabed is its western entrance via that cavity. Look at this. If we look at it from the inside, before we walk out, turn around, and look at it from the other direction, you see that there is a 2 and 1 motif going on. 2 above, 1 below. And in between the two windows above stands another cross. The connection of the human and the divine is through the cross. And when you look at it from outside, it's quite remarkable because you can't really get a very good view of what's going on this facade from the ground level. So why would someone choose to put a very significant piece of sculpture where it can't be seen? Well, when we think about the two levels of the iconography of these facades, perhaps there's a point to it. One does not clearly perceive from the ground level, from the level of time as we normally experience it, the full reality of what is eternally true. And so once again, we see that the bottom sculpture, as on the other church, is the earthly reality of Christ. Jesus on his mother's lap. And she is enthroned on a carpet, it looks like. And as you look at this, you begin to notice that even within the foliage, the vegetation of the physical world, messages are encoded. And you can see letters superimposed on, intertwining with the leaves and possibly fruits in the background. And remembering that you are standing outside the cavity to the Church of St. Garabet, it makes sense that what is concealed in those leaves, the letters that are so hidden there within the ordinary manifestations of the vegetable world, are the words Zain Barbaro Hanabadin, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, the sound of a voice in the wilderness, which is how the prophet Isaiah refers to John in the Christian understanding of that text. And you can see John himself there, his head peeking out from amidst the foliage on the left, with his rough hair, his semi-clothed torso. And on the right, where I can't quite see it, is yet more writing, this time on a scroll, so clearly meant for you to see it if you're close enough.
Going one slide back, what is the image above the cross?
We're getting there.
And also, are there any Chalcedonian articulations in the building?
No, not in this one that I'm aware of, other than those crosses raised on the facade of the Mother of God Church. The St. Garabet Church is a little old for that to have been the case.
Interesting.
But of course, this iconography of the Virgin Mary and Child, with the kind of draperies and so on that she is wearing, does have Byzantine overtones to it. So it's not like there's any rejection of Byzantine aesthetics here. It's just that the preponderant feeling is an Armenian one.
And the doors in the previous one, is there a reason for the stunt doors?
For the which?
These doors?
These are not doors, these are windows.
Was it another slide, Father got up it?
It was the previous church.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Pop on another one. It's okay.
Okay. All right, so this is the lower register of reality, the reality as it was foretold in the Old Testament, as it was experienced in the physical life of Christ. Above that is this. The inscription around it says the story that is included in it. Not that you could get close enough to actually read it, but if you did, you would see it. What is going on in this very complicated sculpture? To the left, you see the crucifixion, Mary and John in attitudes of mourning. Present at the same time and in the same plane of the sculpture as the gigantic head in the middle. A head attached to two very small arms, given the size of the head. The right hand is raised in blessing. The left hand cradles a head. A head that looks, when you look at it from the side, looks remarkably like the big head. It's almost as though the figure above in the center is cradling its own head. And more than that, you can see that there is a bird descending from the large head to the mouth of the small head. And you look at that and you go, what in the world is he smoking when he made this thing? What are we looking at? And then as you read the inscription, you see that it says the Ancient of Days, at the moment he created Adam.
Interesting.
And so you have the head of Adam cradled in the left hand of God as the image of God. It has not yet taken on life. The bird, the spirit, the breath is about to enter into the lifeless form of the first human. And yet, at that very moment, before Adam has even come alive, the crucifixion is present. For Armenians, it's very important to stress that the crucifixion is not plan B. The crucifixion didn't come about, oh, well, Adam sinned, so now we got to do something about that. It was there from the beginning, from before the beginning of humanity. The dynamic of love from the divine to the human, expressed in both actions shown here. The love of God in creating Adam in his very own image, and the love that was already operative to bring Christ into incarnation and to the cross for the sake of that love. The heavenly reality, the eternal reality of human existence, which motivated the incarnational reality, which permeated the prophetic reality. This is it.
Would you consider Christ's image as acknowledging him as the new Adam?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, there are layers to these things. Okay, this is not going quite as quickly as I thought it might. So,
Professor,
yeah,
how is that last, the head of God and the head, is that purely a sculpture thing? Is it in any manuscript illumination or?
there are similarities,
Oh,
but God the Father is very seldom shown.
Yeah.
Usually, if you see the presence of God the Father, it's a hand from a cloud or something like that. It's very unusual to have this. And I think that the sculptor did it simply to make that point about the imagehood of humanity.
But is it the Father that's depicted or Christ?
Yes,
the
absolutely.
Son?
It's the Father.
How do we know?
Because you have the Father, the Spirit, and then you have the human head. And because next to it, it says, the Ancient of Days at the moment he created Adam.
Well, isn't Christ also the Ancient of Days?
No, the Ancient of Days is the Father. I know something is going through your head.
Yeah, the Father can't be depicted.
He can't be depicted, but he is here.
No.
It's very unusual, and it's because the sculptor wants to make that point really clear. And as you can see, this is not down at eye level. This is up. The fact that we have clear photos like this, these were not taken at ground level.
Yeah, and Father Garapet is also saying in painted iconography, God the Father is not depicted.
Yes.
Because he is spirit. But I believe this is one of the only
This is one of the
instances,
very few.
very few.
And he's doing it specifically to make that imagehood point.
Yeah.
And you see that Christ's head is tilted and he's looking up at the Father. So there's that dynamic between the two of them as well. His hand overlaps the arm of the Father. So there's a unity in their activity. Okay, I want to go, we can do this, go relatively quickly through Ganzasar, where I have never been and will probably never be. A place that was founded in the 10th century or earlier, acquired the Church of St. John the Baptist between 1216 and 1229. Constructed on the orders of Hassan Jalal Dawla, who, in spite of his name, is the Armenian prince of an area called Inner Khachen, one of the many small principalities or kingdoms that made up the area we call Artsakh, and by the patriarch of the house of the Hassan Jalaliya. The church was consecrated on July 22nd, the year 1240, on the Feast of the Transfiguration, I think in Batavar, with 700 priests in attendance. Artsakh, there was no question, was Christian. The large square kavit that you can see to the left of the church in this picture was started in 1240, was not completed until 1266 by a man named Atabek, again, despite his name, an Armenian, the son of Hassan Jalal and his wife, Mamkan. Giragos Ganzagetsi, who was a historian contemporary to these events, described the construction of this church in his History of Armenia. And Ganzasar became the seat, the later seat, obviously, that it had earlier seats, of the Catholicosate of Caucasian Albania, which was one of the sees of the Armenian Church in the late 14th century, and it had a very long relationship, sometimes troubled, but more often not, with the Armenian Church. It's possible that seating the Caucasian Albanian Catholicosate here was a way of expressing its continued authority and its ecclesiastical, at least semi-autonomy within this region. It was a way of creating a center for a very divided area, giving a central pontificate control over all of these smaller entities. On a more kind of, what do you call it, jaundiced view, it has also been suggested that this sighting of the Caucasian Albanian Catholicosate here was part of an Islamic plot to preserve the appearance of religious authority by the people for the people. And in the 16th century, as the Caucasian Albanian Catholicosate began its decline, this monastery was taken over by the Etchmiadzin Catholicosate to be staffed by them. Here you can see again, the structure of this dome is a little bit unusual. There are folds on the drum corresponding to the folds in the kumpet. You can see the same elevated cross on the facade. From here, you can see that it's not alone. It stands at the middle of a cemetery complex. Oh, sorry about this picture. The quality is not good, but I wanted to get a closer view of that cross. More modest in size than some of the others, but still very clear. Here it is. Sitting above an eternity symbol. You can see that what looks like a multi-petaled flower beneath it. And as we get closer like this, you can see that there's a small cross. There's also a kind of outline, perhaps, of the universal globe underneath the cross. And then in each one of those panels on the dome is a separate figure. Again, I don't have a clear picture of these. Some of them are people from the time, others are decorative, and others represent biblical stories. So here is the builder presenting his church. And those kinds of interlaced panels of vegetation above are similar to what we just saw at Noravank and above the door in Harichavan. The doorway to this church, the doorway to the Kabi, again, seems to be the main focus, is an extraordinary structure. Here, it's absolutely and abundantly clear that the cross is the door. And again, you have those extra tall steps.
And is the church building upon is it a separate dome?
Pardon?
A separate dome? Is it on a step? Oh, is it?
It's on a stylobate. It's got several steps leading up to the church.
Crepidome. No.
I do not know what that is.
Probably got up what I was asking. I think it's the base of the church.
Yeah. So yes, and there's I don't remember how many steps this one has, but there's no doubt a reason for it. You can see the tiny windows with the little eyebrows over them.
Can you put your thing up? I think he has a question. So this one. It's muted. There you go. Okay. So Claudia Garapit, do you want to ask the question? I think we can hear you now.
Okay, my question was the church built on a stylobate or crepidum?
Yes.
And you did
yes.
answer that. And it's 3. Do stylobates have a significance in terms of numbers when
Often, yes.
constructed?
Often, yes. So the foundation of the church on the Trinity would be a logical thought. And you can see as you look at this door, that not only is it set within the cross, but there's a cross set within it as well. Here's a drawing of the precinct. A view from the inside of the church within the cavity. Single door, single window, flanked by 2 windows. The dome, traditional, old style, from the inside, not from the outside. 4 windows, 8 sections. Here we have not 8 pointed crosses, but 6, making a statement about the creation rather than about eternity. And here we have this, just in case we were thinking that 6 pointed stars were the prerogative of Judaism only. No, Armenian uses them as well. In the center of this 6 pointed star, this double triangle star, you have the eternity symbol, the wheel. One of the many hodgepodge scattered around this building, and then this. Again, high up. No one is going to see this thing. The donor of the church has placed himself as one of the 2 figures flanking Christ on the cross. Christ who is standing there voluntarily. There is no sagging of the body. There are no signs of death. There is simply the willing to be there in this figure. The interlacing of eternity as the extension of those very long arms on the cross. So this private piece of devotion by the person who built the church, I think, is exceptionally beautiful, and there are more of those stars up above intertwining with crosses. Here you have another double register carving. The celestial reality is Christ blessing creation below in the form of Adam and Eve who have just sinned and who have acquired garments of skin, which all of us actually still wear, who have become a kind of heavy and bloated version of their original glorious reality. So we could go on and on with churches in the Armenian highlands. This is an incredibly rich time period, and there are hundreds of these things, one more beautiful than the last. But I want to step outside of the Armenian highlands for the last few minutes of our time together. Even though there are difficulties in studying the architecture of this time and place outside of Armenia. For one thing, most of the places that were occupied by Armenians lie within present-day Turkey. And the monuments are in very sad condition, as we saw already with Avakbank. Second, when Armenians moved out farther than that, when they moved out into the Cilician Mountains and the seacoast as newcomers, each one vying for better possessions in the area with the intention of someday being able to unify the scattered population living there, they took over the properties of others and then retrofitted them. So Armenian fortifications and churches in Cilicia are most often structures that were built before they arrived in the region by other people for their own needs. And the same is true of the substantial Armenian communities that there were in the Crimea and what's now Ukraine and Poland. So we're going to look at one exception to that rule, one that was purpose-built by Armenians on the Crimean Peninsula in a place called Stari Khrem, built in the middle of the 14th century. Here's a map to help orient you to it if you're not already familiar with this map from the Russo-Ukrainian War. There were Armenian populations in Yalta, Sevastopol, Feodosia. This is the church, the monastery of the Holy Cross. And you look at this complex of buildings and you go, Armenian, fantastic, definitely an Armenian place. And then you look at it and you go, but there's something wrong with it. There are things about this that are not Armenian looking. What is Armenian looking, of course, is the dome. But the dome is flat. It's almost, it looks like it's been squashed. The drum is nice, it has beautiful little blind arches on it. But the angle of the dome itself is not right. Clearly, an effort has been made to harmonize the setting of this structure. This is a recent addition to it. You can see these lovely khachkars lining the road to the church. So there are familiar elements here. To walk into the church, you would probably know that that structure is Armenian. It's got 3 altars for one thing. The icon in the niche is probably not Armenian, but okay. You can see it has a curtain, not an iconostasis. You also see the staircase leading up to the private chapel, the private area. That looks familiar, but that archway next to it, not so much. The cross and the wall, definitely. Those look Armenian. They have Armenian inscriptions. They are familiar. But there are also things that are not Armenian, things that are a little unfamiliar to someone coming from the outside, an Armenian from somewhere else, approaching this building, would have second thoughts, perhaps. The structure doesn't look Armenian. The structure has a Byzantine-ish roof, but then it has almost a Roman Catholic quality about its squareness. And the door certainly gives off the impression of Roman Catholicism. And in fact, it's no surprise to hear that it was the community, Armenian community of Crimea, that actually represented the Armenian Catholicosate Council of Florence. Whereas a kind of an afterthought, union with Rome was negotiated on behalf of the nation by a small group of Crimeans. Another purpose-built monastery by Armenians was this one, called either Ervine or Aganzanabad. It was built between 1198 and 1203 by King Levon the Great, Levon the First. It was his favorite monastery by far. Had a beautiful location near Adana, above the Sehan River. And he found its commanding position to be both restful and strategic. And he would often go here as often as he could get away and spend time with his spiritual director, a man who, considering the rest of Levon's life, probably had an uphill job. This is what it looks like now. It originally had 3 churches, as well as the monastic residences around them. It had a Holy Mother of God, of course, Suphagop and Suphotarakelos, St. James, and the Holy Apostles. And when we look at this, we question, is this possibly an Armenian structure? There's really nothing about it to indicate it. If you come at it from the side, what you see is something that really looks more like maybe a Syriac basilica to my non-specialist eye. It's a big church. You can see that it had 2 stories. Again, not an Armenian trait normally. More of a Byzantine possibility or a Roman possibility. There are 3 windows in its altar apse. Again, unusual, not totally unheard of, but quite unusual. You can see the stone was very good quality, well built. And then you have these odd kinds of tower things with angles. You can imagine sitting behind something like this and having a fabulous view. But the thing itself doesn't strike you immediately as, oh yeah, that's an Armenian church. Here's another view of one of those windows with the view that you would get if you were looking out. So even though it was built by an Armenian king and housed an extraordinary Armenian brotherhood, it's not really a highly Armenian structure. It's not making a statement about its Armenianness. It's making a statement about its monasticness, but not about its Armenianness. And King Levon wanted to be buried here, but as luck would have it, he died at a distance from Agner, and under the circumstances of the time, they were not going to take days to transport his body up there. So they buried his body elsewhere, and they put his heart in a vessel, carried it up here. And somewhere in this vicinity, that vessel still remains with the heart of Levon in it. And finally, last but definitely not least in my opinion, also a Cilician church, though not in Cilicia, not in Armenia, is the Cathedral of St. James in Jerusalem. Many of you may be familiar with its interior. If you're not, again, highly recommend. The 4th or 5th century chapels, 2 of which you can see here, that are at the heart of this cathedral, contain architectural remains that date to the very earliest days of Christianity. According to tradition, in one of these chapels, one can see the foundations of the actual home of St. James. Several of Jesus's disciples, closest disciples, had places in Jerusalem very close to the temple, prized pieces of property. The cathedral, however, this is at the chapel in which the head of St. James, son of Zebedee, is buried. And there are all kinds of fantastic stories around that, but anyway. The church as it is today, mostly in its present enlarged form, except for a women's gallery that was later added to the west wall, making it look very square from the outside. This part of the church, the main structure that we are familiar with, was built between 1142 and 1162. Not exactly sure when within that time period, maybe the whole time period, actually, in the days of the princes Toros and Rupenyan. And there's a separate church in the monastery dedicated to the memory of Toros. We know that it was built by 1162 because a German pilgrim in that year mentions the church as being newly finished. And there are two memorial crosses in the facade of the church that date from that time period. There's also this one, 1153 is its date, which was a few years ago discovered when they took down the plaster in the church in order to make some repairs. They discovered that underneath the plaster were 20 khachkars. Some of them of pretty extraordinary quality, like this one, as you can see. It's a full interlace standing on a staircase made of interlace. So you have like the endless quality of eternity depicted in that interlace, which has no beginning, no end. I was also able to find this picture totally serendipitously. I've never seen it before. It's a picture that was taken by a Jewish scholar working in the cathedral. Usually the main altar in the cathedral is covered with a very fancy frontal, some kind of an embroidered or silver gilt apron that's put around the altar to preserve it. This, however, is what's underneath. 12th century altar. As you can see, covered in graffiti. Crosses to the left, crosses and eternity symbols to the right, some Armenian letters. Apart from its general kind of Armenian features, this is also an extremely tall church, partly because of the fondness that Armenian rulers seem to have for that upward motion and that more impressive interior space. But the height also makes it possible for this church to be fully two-storied without appearing so. So as you can see towards the right of your screen, there is an arch below. You can see the icon, the khachkal, the golden khachkal, which was added later in the 17th century or 18th century. And then above, you see a full other chapel. This is just to the left of the main altar. There is a corresponding double structure, full-size chapel above, to the right of the altar. And if you think back to an earlier point in this evening's presentation, it will not surprise you at all to learn that one of those upper chapels is named for St. Peter, the other is named for St. Paul. To get to those chapels, you have to go through the wall, into the wall like a mouse, and make your way up to the level of these chapels, which people do for the feast of Peter and Paul. And Badarak is celebrated on those altars. In order to support the incredible weight of this two-story structure, the pillars in this church are enormous. And they hold up above themselves a dome that, although it looks unusual and interesting to us, was actually a very fashionable kind of cutting-edge design in the 12th century. The dome is a full six-pointed star. So yes, it's the Star of David, Christ being the Son of David. It's also the triangular representation of the Trinity divine and the Trinity human, our own Trinity as embodied beings, centering around the unity of the peak of that dome. This is a form that was used in Armenia. This is interesting. It's being built by a Cilician king, but he knows what the latest fashion is in Armenia, in the homeland. where you will find this same structure at monasteries like Khoranashat, which is out in Tavush, Khorashan, Milos, Magar. There are a number of monasteries deep in the Armenian highlands. These are not like down in the center of the country, that also choose to make this statement in their dome at around the same time, to intertwine the realities of the divine and the human, the similarities of them, without any figural representation at all. It's purely geometric. So our little tour of these structures, just a few, as I said, of the very many that were built in this time period, shows us how, as their architecture progressed in this time period, particularly, a time period when Armenians were also beginning to write their first discursive homilies, homilies that were meant for the average person, not for someone to use as teaching notes. There's also this proliferation of much more explicit theological statements in the decoration and the form of a church building. So next week, Dr. Shahinian is going to take us back into the Armenian highlands, back into the heartland of Lake Van, a place that was, again, packed with churches to a degree that it's almost impossible to realize now. I don't think there was any spot on the shore of Lake Van that was out of earshot of prayer on any given day.
Wow.
It's amazing, right?
I don't have that many people to
Oh, yes,
do this thing.
absolutely. And some of the monasteries had large brotherhoods, in addition to the people that would come there. And the different monasteries had different specialties, Narekavant being one of them, obviously. So to go back into a world where the architecture of prayer and worship is that packed is what we will do next week under her guidance, spending, I believe, a significant amount of time at Catholicos State Achtamar and its center, the Holy Cross. So thank you very much.